This mini-lecture discusses the master budget and the various functional budgets that combine to make it a complete integrated forecast of the coming year. The need in particular to roll the component parts up into a full cash forecast is stressed, and the consequent ability to make an initial assessment of the feasibility of the whole forecast scenario. So let's talk about the preparation of a master budget. There is a logical set or sequence of events in preparing a master budget. The whole process of a master budget is about negotiating the most probable outcome for the organisation, setting objectives and targets right through the organisation with the goal of achieving an outcome which will move the organisation towards the strategic direction consistent with where the board positions it. So whilst a budget is not a strategy, it certainly needs to be consistent with the strategy of the organisation. There's no point in pointing an organisation in a different direction from its strategy. The outputs from the budgeting process will be a budgeted income statement, a budgeted balance sheet, and a budgeted cash flow and statement of cash flows. Now, these will be the final outcomes of the whole process which precedes it. Individual functional budgets are prepared in great detail, and they gradually roll up into the final summary statements. And when you've got those final summary statements, what you must do is sit down and analyse them to make sure that the outcomes that you're projecting paint a picture of a reasonable expectation, of a sustainable business, and of a sense that where you're targeting is achievable, but not so easily that we can all basically cut back the amount of work we do and take early marks every evening and perhaps have 4-day weeks. So it needs to be something which we can achieve, but for which we have to work quite hard. What's the role of the cash budget? Well, the cash budget, as the name implies, simply shows where we expect the cash to come from and what we expect to be spending it on, and as a result, what are the cash balances which result. When we do that cash budget, it's usually the first outcome of the whole budgeting process, and it's usually the first opportunity where we should sit back and reflect on what it is we're forecasting. Because what will come out of a good analysis of the cash budget, it's a determination about whether what you're forecasting is feasible and probable or unlikely and unachievable. For example, if your cash budget forecasts that you're going to have a cash surplus of many hundreds of millions of dollars, the probability is that you've got it wrong. Very few businesses are able to forecast that. If your cash budget forecasts that you're going to need overdraft facilities of many millions of dollars, again, you're probably going to have to go back and have a look at some of your assumptions, because what that outcome of huge deficits is telling you is that the budget you're forecasting represents a business model which is not sustainable. So the cash budget is the first point where we have pause and we think about whether the collection of subsidiary budgets that have been produced, when they come together, appear as if they will be defining a sustainable and sensible set of outcomes. Now, it's certainly true that we can possibly develop extra cash flow, excess cash flow, and if that's the case, then we should plan to be investing it and doing something with the cash. And similarly, if it's reasonable to plan for a cash shortfall, which we would hope would be temporary, permanent ones are not a very good signal, then we can plan to borrow or put in facilities to cope with that at the best rates going. If we wait until we find we don't have cash, then it's probable that the sources of potential funding will think that we are bad planners and not aware of what our business is doing and maybe won't lend to us. The master budget always starts with the sales forecasts. This is because the level of sales defines the level of activity of the organisation for the next 12 months. You can think of it as asking the question, how hard is my organisation going to be running? How much heavy lifting are we going to be doing? And the answer to that lies in the sales budget. That will tell you what the overall organisational rate of activity is. That means that you have to budget for your sales by product, by selling price, and in great detail, understanding what is the market situation, what is the competition doing, what are the risks, and what is the impact of your price decision on your sales volumes, and how you're going to manage all of those variables realistically. So the sales budget involves a lot of understanding what's going on in your organisation and in your market and in your competitors' market. Once the sales budget has been agreed, both in volume terms and in monetary terms, that information then becomes a key input to many other budgets within the organisation. And the first and most obvious of those budgets is the production budget. You can almost envisage the signal flowing from the sales budget down the line to the production area where they say, right, now we know how hard we're going to have to run. We know what level of product we're going to have to make available to the sales team. So let's plan how we're going to do that. And so the production area swings into action and starts to forecast both the volumes and the monetary implications. They in turn have to break down their production into many sub-budgets. And so there'll be a budget for the purchasing and introduction of raw materials. There'll be another budget for labour procurement and rates. There'll be another budget for factory manufacturing overheads. And all of these will have to be forecast in great detail. I have to tell you at this stage, there is no shortcut in the budgeting process. Every single item needs to be examined and needs to be forecast. So you'll forecast everything in the production environment, and that in turn then will flow back into the support environment. So it'll flow back into the purchasing function, where they get a signal about how much and when they're going to have to purchase inputs. It'll flow back into the warehousing area, where they'll get a signal about how much inventory they'll have to be maintaining, and whether they'll have the facilities to do that, or whether they need to locate extra storage facilities, or whether we need to change our inventory policies from the levels that we presently have them to perhaps closer to just in time. How will we manage the inventory? What levels of risk are involved in the possibility of running out of inventory? And so the planning goes on. Which leads us then to functional budgets. If we have already forecast the top two lines in the income statement, that's the sales line and the cost of goods sold line, then after that, every one of the functional budgets below the gross profit line also have to be forecast. And so you can see again the information flows down to warehousing, information technology, support functions such as administration and HR. Every item in every one of those budgets has to be forecast. Now I'd like you to think back to our discussion about fixed costs and variable costs at this point. In forecasting every item, we have to identify and know which are fixed costs, which don't respond to the volume signal, and which are variable costs, which do respond to the volume signal. And that will inform the way that you forecast every item by understanding its fixed components and its variable components. Now, once we've forecast all of the detail, then we can start to roll up all of those detailed budgets until eventually they roll right up into a budgeted income statement, a budgeted cash flow statement, and a budgeted balance sheet. Well, now you'll be understanding that this is a fully iterative process. The first run through the whole system usually produces an outcome that would cause many of us to have a seizure and think, my goodness, what are we doing? Let's go back to the drawing board. That's not unusual. That's why we analyse the outcomes to see if they represent a sustainable business model. What it usually results in is changing some of our key assumptions which might go back as far as the actual volume and pricing of sales or production or staffing or any one or all of the support budgets. What we have to do is recalculate and analyse again, and we go through this iterative process until we eventually get a set of budgetary papers which we can analyse and look at and confidently say, yes, they're sending our organisation in the direction of the strategic plan. Yes, they represent a sustainable business. Yes, they'll give adequate rewards to all of the stakeholders who are involved in this business, and that includes, of course, the equity providers, but it's not limited to them. It also includes all of the other stakeholders, the community stakeholders, environmental stakeholders, governance requirements. All of the stakeholders need to be thought of at this point to see whether the budget that we plan is actually likely to deliver their realistic and reasonable expectations. Once management believes that it has a budget which answers all of those questions, then it becomes the function of management to sell that budget to the board. The board in turn will analyse it and decide whether they think it's appropriate, whether they in turn think that it achieves all of the outcomes and satisfies all of the stakeholders that they need to satisfy. And if they do, then they're likely to approve it. If they don't, it's back to the drawing board and through the iterative process again. Now, once that budget has been approved, then it takes on another status. It takes on the status of a bilateral contract between management and the board. And in doing that, what the board has authorised is management and all of the people who work for management to move into gear and to undertake the forecast activities and spend the forecast amounts that are in that approved budget.